So welcome to validate this, that, and the other thing. First, I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I want to thank the organizers for putting it together, to Sam Parsons for inviting me to come speak, and Object Partners for hosting us here. Let's go ahead and get started. That's a Joe Dirt reference, if you're not familiar with Joe Dirt. The name of my library, it's not really a Joe Dirt reference, it's almost a Joe Dirt reference. The name of my library is Validate This, and when I say that, I do mean it as a bit of a challenge, because I really think that my library can validate any JavaScript object as long as you're performing synchronous validations, I'm hoping that I'll be able to prove that to you this evening. A little bit about me first. My name's Sam Slotsky, and that, believe it or not, is one of the better pictures of me. Up on the North Shore with my family. I have a wife and 3 kids. I have a thing for jazz. I am a software engineer at Ackman & Dickinson, which, as I've mentioned, is hiring. So please check out our website. I'm super duper bad at slides, so hopefully you'll bear with me. But on that note, I also forgot to thank, to give a shout out to Formidable Labs. This was made with Spectacle, which allowed me to make these slides in React. And without that, I'm sure this would have been at least 100 times worse than it's going to be. But with that said, I have several slides to present to you on this topic, so let's get started with just talking about what the library is, what it does. So Validate This will validate any JavaScript object. It doesn't matter how deeply nested it is. Nested objects, nested arrays, doesn't matter. It will return another JavaScript object that has complete error information about the input object, and it's going to match the structure of the input object as well. It's agnostic. It doesn't care what framework you use. It has absolutely 0 dependencies. It's pure JavaScript. But I say that it not so accidentally works really well with redux-form, and the reason for that is because I wrote it to make redux-form validations easier for myself. If you're familiar with redux-form, they are really unopinionated about how you do your validations as long as you return an object that has the right structure. And it's a really reasonable structure, so you can use this with anything, and it's up to you how you integrate it with whatever UI you're using. But the examples that you'll see today are all going to be React-based and redux-form-based. So the last point here is that in this library, custom validations are first-class citizens. And this is really important to me because I don't want to be in the business of telling you how to do validations. If you're familiar with like Ruby on Rails, for example, they have really great validations in Active Record, validates inclusion, numericality, presence, all this stuff. And those are really great, but I'm just not in that business. You decide what's valid or invalid. I make it easy for you to apply those rules to a deeply nested JavaScript object. Having said that, I do have a few built-in validations, and they're all here on the screen. So for example, in this first one, we could validate that the username, the password, and the password confirmation fields are required fields, so it would give an error if those don't have a value. Yes? Oh, okay. Absolutely. So yeah, the first line of this validation function, it's going to add errors to the object if the username, password, or password confirmation are blank. The second line will make sure that the password confirmation matches the password field. The third line is numeric. I mean, what the heck? You know, let's have a numeric validation. Maybe they have a GPA or something. It should be numeric. So I want to actually jump over to a code sandbox so I can demonstrate some of this stuff. So I present to you your cousin Marty, who is, it's an object with some properties. He's 29, he's got a dog, he's got a couple kids, and we're validating some stuff about Marty. So right now we can see that Marty is failing validation. There's one required field that Marty doesn't have. So I want to jump into the validate function to see what that is. And it says that Marty is supposed to have a social security number. So we can make this validation go away by just giving him a social security number. It doesn't have to be a valid social. We just want to make sure that it's there. So no more error messages because now Marty has a social security number. So for now, I won't demonstrate the other built-in validations. I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is message translation. So you might not necessarily like the error message that comes out of your of the built-in validation functions. I actually designed them to be more like translation keys, so that you can plug it into internationalization if you want. And that's what this example does. After my validation, I have a function that takes the error message and the field that's in error. And in this case, it feeds it into an internationalization function that puts the keys in there. It would spit out a message. So we can take a look at that in action as well. Let's give Marty his error back and go into the validate function and make a custom, we'll make a custom translation function. So it takes a message in a field, and it's just going to make sure that it displays the field info along with the message info, so that for our UI here, we have a better idea of what's valid or invalid. So now we see that Marty's SSN is required, and he doesn't have it. So now, hopefully it starts to get a little bit more interesting. Nested objects and arrays. So before now, this was a little bit trivial. Big deal, you can validate stuff on a flat object. You know, why do you need a special library for that? It turns out that when it comes to digging in, a lot of the examples that you find online are really one-off and don't lend themselves to a lot of reuse. And you might want to dig in really deeply. I mean, you might have a deep form. I wouldn't advise it, but you might have a really deep form. So in this example, maybe your form has some nested address information. And so in this first example, we're validating that the address has the street address information. Likewise, you might have an array of contacts. And so the validate child let us dig into the address. Validate children lets us dig into a child array. So in this case, we could validate that a contact has a name and an email provided. So let's check this out in our code sandbox as well. You remember that Marty has a dog and he has 2 children. So we could add some validation to the dog and the children. We'll start with the dog. So we say form validate child, and we give it the property name, which is dog, and then a function. And I'm going to take an opportunity for some audience participation here. Who wants to suggest something that should be required for a dog? A tail, okay. Let's just say, okay, tail, validates tail is required. So now we see that the dog has an error message because he doesn't have a tail, all right? So let's go back into our dog and give him a tail. Dog says he has a tail, we're just gonna take his word for it. Sorry? Okay, how about the children? We can validate some stuff about the children as well. So in this case, we use the method validate children. And in this case, the children are named children. Won't always be that way. But for each child, we can validate that some fields are required. So what's required for a child? Anybody?
Sleep 8 hours a night.
Okay. Fantastic, fantastic. So for each child, we will validate sleeps 8 hours. Now, technically, we should validate that, that this is true rather than some kind of falsy value. But for now, we'll just validate that it's required. So both children are failing this validation, which should be expected. But we can go back and we can say maybe our 9-year-old is a little bit better behaved, a little bit more controllable, sleeps 8 hours. Yes, he does. And so now only the second child is failing validation. So the next topic then after nested objects and arrays is nested translations. So just like you could give a custom translation function to your outermost validation function, you can give another one to the validate child and validate children. So in this case, the messages come from forms.newuser.address rather than just forms.newuser. So maybe you just want the validation message to read a little different. So to demonstrate that, we could add a custom validation to our children validation. So once again, this takes a message in a field, and we can just append something in front. Maybe a child validation can just be called kid problems, because a lot of us, I'm sure, have kid problems. So we can just do the field and the message again. And so now child number 1 has got some kid problems, namely doesn't sleep enough. Next, let's talk about custom validations. So this is really what I think makes this library the most powerful. As I said before, we only have a few built-in validations. So this library is not going to do much for you if you don't write your own custom validations. Although if you want some more built-in validations, you can submit a pull request. But in any case, to perform custom validations, there's actually 2 ways to do it. So the first way is perfectly good, and it's creating your own built-in rules, and you do that with the define validator function. So in this case, we would actually be overriding our required validation, and just having it return a new message cannot be blank dude. So I'm just going to lift this right out of here, and let's use it. Oops, no, I do not want to leave this page. Let's use it here. So I will import the define validator function and just paste in what I had. And now all my required fields say cannot be blank dude instead of simply required. So that is a pretty good way to write custom validations, but I happen to think there is a much better way. And that is to satisfy any condition. So the first 2 functions here are higher order validation functions. It takes some input that it takes some value that it forms a closure around, and it returns a validation function that compares the value against that input. So you might have a function where you want to say that a value is greater than a certain n or less than a certain n. And then with the satisfies function, you can pass in as many of these conditions as you want. So in this case, I'm saying that the person's age should be greater than 17, lower than 26. So once again, we'll jump over to our code sandbox and see this in action. So I have a few custom validation rules already written. Let's start with this first one on top, must be breed. So maybe Marty's taken his dog to a dog show, and maybe they are only accepting German Shepherd dogs. Marty has a dog, it happens to be a Schnauzer. So let's say that the breed must satisfy the condition. Must be breed, oops, German Shepherd. And now we see that the dog is validating, is failing validation because the dog's the wrong breed. As usual, I could change this to the right value and make the error go away as long as I spelled it right. So that is, oh, you know what, we have some more custom rules we can look at. Older than age, must be even. You could validate that a number is even. These are just really simple contrived examples. Valid social, since I kind of expected that one of you might challenge me to write a validation that Marty has an actual valid social. Why don't we go ahead and do it? We will say that, sorry, this is up here. Yes, yes, good call. So we'll say that the social security number satisfies rules.is valid social, I think is what I called it. Oh, that must not have been it. Let me just double check that back in rules. Valid social. Valid social. You Booleans are always giving me trouble. Okay, with the valid social, now we see that it's failing both the required validation and the valid social validation. So if we go back and Marty wants to say that his social is none of your business, it'll pass the required validation, but it's not a valid social. So let's go and change it to a valid social. And now we're looking good. So those are the custom rules. Now, hopefully, by demonstrating the custom rules, I've shown you guys that this library can really validate anything as long as it's a synchronous operation on a JavaScript object. Let's go back to satisfies. All. It must satisfy all the conditions. Good question. So I really think that with satisfies and the other custom validation mechanisms, you can validate anything. But I don't really know. So far, I haven't come into anything I couldn't do, but I bet at least a handful of you in here are smarter than me, probably most of you. Yes?
What about fields that interrelate, such as password confirmation, or child must be younger than parent?
Okay. Okay, cool. So for password confirmation, we actually had that example. We have that example in the built-in validations. So here's how, here's what I haven't told you. That's a really good question, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to find my place. So a validation rule doesn't just take a value, it also takes all the values. So let's write a validation rule called matches. We already have this built in, but this is how you would write it if you were doing a custom validation. So this takes a field name, and then it returns one of our validation functions. Now, the first argument is the value of the field that's being validated, but the second argument is the values. And this will be the values of basically the level where you're at. So if you're validating a child, this will be the values of that level, at that level of the object, right? So you would say if value is not equal to values field name, then you would return an error message. So that's how you would write that. Should we test it real quick? Should we see if it works? Okay, so let's say Marty has a password. And Marty has a password confirmation which does not match. So given those bits of data, we can go back into the validate function. And we can say that we'll validate that the confirm satisfies rules matches password. Oops. Oh boy. I'm a Vim user, so I mess up a lot. Okay, so confirm does not currently match. It's failing that validation. If I go back in and I change this to match the value, now the validation's gone. And you actually beat me to this. This was going to be my opportunity where I ask you to challenge me to write more validations, because I'm sure you guys can come up with something I can't do. Seriously though, no regex. That social security number, I lifted it off of Stackoverflow. You know that I did. I can't do regex on the spot. If you can, good for you. Sorry, did someone say they have something? No? Okay. Oh yeah, yeah. If you can, seriously, you deserve a raise. Anyone have any other things they want me to validate? All children younger than parent. Okay, you know what? That's a good one. That is fantastic. So you literally mean all and not each, don't you? Each? Okay, okay. Sure. All right, so that's a pretty good one. In fact, that's fantastic. So let's see if we can do this. In my validation, I have my values up here, my top level form values. So if I go down to my children, I could say that, you know, child validate age satisfies a rule that I haven't created yet. Rules must be older than, let's say, values.age, because that is Marty's age. That's how we get Marty's age. So obviously must be, sorry? Must, yeah, good call. The child should not be older. That would be very weird. Must be younger than, okay, yeah, I would certainly hope so. Okay, let's write the rule then. This could be interesting. So export const must be younger than some age if, okay, so if the age is less than or equal to the value, then I can return this person is far too old. Okay, and did it work? It looks like it did not work. So I'm not totally sure why. That's sort of what makes it interesting about being put on the spot. You don't know if you're, sorry? Rule. Good question. So the ages were, oh yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, good point. They're not failing validation because they are younger. So if I make one of these children older, then they should fail. There we go. This person is far too old. Excellent. Any others? Well, you know what? See, Code Sandbox has this wonderful feature where you type in a package name and you add the package. And Email Validator is this nice little package that will perform that logic for us so that we don't have to. So let's go back into the rules. And let's see, I think it's just import email from Email Validator. And I'm still trying to use Vim. I need to stop that. Export const is valid email. If not email, I think it's called validate value, not a valid email. Okay. Now we want to validate that Marty has a valid email. So form.validate email satisfies rules is valid email. And he doesn't even have an email address, so of course it's not going to be valid. So let's give him one. Email, not a valid address, should still fail validation, and it does. However, that's a good email address, so the error goes away. Any others?
What if you do like a combine on that satisfy that says like, if there's an email address, that's the satisfy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would actually do that in the rule itself. So this won't fail validation unless there is an email address and it's invalid. So I could say if value and it's invalid. That's how I would handle it. Yep.
What if you wanted to find out that like one of our children is
Okay. Well, I guess what I would do is define the teenage years. What would you define them as? 13 through 18? Is 19 a teenager? It's, yes? Okay. Okay. 25, yes, good answer. Okay, sure, let's try this. So we can say that teen years, and I'm not about to write the JavaScript range function. It should exist. It doesn't exist for some reason. So we'll just say that it's 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. 25 is fair, but let's keep it simple. So I guess you would say if it's not the case that teen years includes the value, then you would return must be a teenager. And so now we could validate that the children are teenagers. All right. Child.validate age satisfies rules must be, sorry, what did I call it? Must be, oh, is teenager. Is teenager, okay. Is teenager. Our kids are not teenager. This one is far too old, but not a teenager. So the second kid then can be 15. Kid now passes the teenager validation. I have one more topic before we close, but are there any other validation requests? I can do this all night, maybe. This guy's a troublemaker. At least one children is a teenager. Okay, okay, all right. Okay. So here's what I, okay. That's really good. In this case, I would probably add like a base level error, right? So you could add an error to a property that's not really a field and call it base errors, and maybe they'd appear on the top of the form instead of like on a field specific, like you know, in a relevant area. So instead of doing that inside the validate children, this would probably be form validate, we'll just call it underscore base. This is actually something you can do in redux-form, by the way, if you want top level, like form level errors that aren't specific to a field, underscore base, or it might be underscore error. I don't really remember. Yeah, this sort of thing has come up for me before. So you would say satisfies, let's just put the function in line here, okay? So it takes a value, which we don't care about. Actually, you know what? We don't care about any of this stuff. We don't care about the arguments at all. So we would say, okay. Let's just sort of repeat some of the logic here. Teen years is 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And, okay. So you said at least one, right? At least one. Okay. At least one equals values, children. So is there some child for whom the teen years includes c.age, child.age? Okay, so if there's not at least one, you need to have at least one teen. Okay. So I think I have at least one teen, so this isn't going to fail right now. So let's change this guy back to 9 years old. Aha, and here we go. Error, you need to have at least one teen. It worked. I surprise even myself sometimes. No more trouble from you. Anybody else? Going, gone. Okay, let's move on to what I think a lot of us might be here for, which is integrating this into redux form. So what good's the validation if you can't display the errors somehow? In redux form, you have this redux form decorator that you apply to your component. And that decorator takes a configuration object, and one of the properties you can specify is this validate property, which is your validation function. And that takes your form values, and it takes the props that were passed in the component, and then you have to return an object. That's all you have to do. You have to return an object with the correct structure, so that it maps to your values object. It matches the structure. So if you add a shot of validate this, it should look really familiar. You call the validator, which is the validate this function, and you perform the validations just like we've been doing in an example. So you don't have to do anything special. You just call the function, it returns the errors object, and then you get your field level errors for free. So let's take a look at an example of that, not in the code sandbox. Here I have what I guess you could call a login form. It looks more like a sign-up form because it has a password confirmation, but it's just for demonstration purposes. I don't have a username filled in, so let's fix that. Password and confirm are both required. I have a password now, so the validation errors go away. Confirmation currently fails 2 validations. It's blank, and it doesn't match the password. Now it's no longer blank, but it still doesn't match the password. Now that we're matching the password, the form is totally valid, so my save button is now enabled. I can click that, and if my API is being responsive right now, which it might not be, it's going to log me in as blah, 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 which is not really the important point, but hey, welcome, blah, blah, blah. We can take a look at the code that's driving this. So if you've seen redux form, if you've worked with it, you're familiar with this, okay? We have a component that renders these field components, which are redux form components, where you pass in the field name and you pass in the component that you want to render the field. Here I'm using a custom input from a form components library that I built to integrate with redux form, which I won't tell you about because it's awful. But it works for our purposes. So it's a typical redux form component displaying these fields, and then down below you have your redux form decorator that gives it a form name and a validation function. And this is what we've been seeing all along in the slides. We're validating the username, the password, and the confirmation. But notice here, I'm not using my built-in validations. I'm using satisfies. And that's because I just prefer to use it. I just think it works better. It's more flexible. For one thing, it allows me to return exactly the errors I want. And if I'm not doing internationalization, that's pretty handy for me. I don't want to hook things up into some big internationalization function if I'm not actually supporting multiple languages. So I mean, here's my custom validation rules. They're written a little bit differently than the ones that we've already saw. I have a generic error if function that takes a fail condition and a message. It returns a message if the condition fails, and then these 2 validations just kind of use that. But that is actually all I have. So I want to open it up for questions. Thanks. If you guys want to throw tomatoes at me, you can do that too, but any questions? Anything? Ah ha ha. That's funny. And actually, you know what? I was also going to offer a deep dive into the code for anyone who's interested, but since you mentioned that, somebody filed an issue saying, boy, they would prefer if we had TypeScript bindings for this package. So you're not alone in that request. I personally am a fan of Flow. I haven't made bindings for that either. So as I've mentioned previously, I'm welcoming pull requests. I totally invite you to submit some bindings for TypeScript, as long as they are like tested, demonstrated, whatever. I look at you with the ideas. Okay, help wanted. Yes, yes. Now that more than 2 people know about my library, that might work. Any other questions? Yes. Good question. I have some tests. Let's take a look at them. I haven't looked at them in a really long time. So validation. So these are just basic Mocha tests. Okay. So for example, I define that I verify that define validator works. So for example, this custom method, after I define a custom validator with the name of custom, now my validator should have the custom method. That method should exist. What else? I'm testing out the custom translations, the satisfies function. I give it a bunch of rules. And so like in this case, I take a couple rules that unconditionally return errors. And then I verify that when I run my validator and I satisfy both of these rules, that both of those errors are returned on my errors object. And so I just have a bunch of different tests like that make sure that the object has the errors in the right place when you run validate child, validate children, so on and so forth. Similarly, I have tests for the built-in rules that I have just to make sure that they return an error under the right circumstances and return undefined when they're passing. Does redux-form know about my library? Yes. The author of redux-form is at least somewhat familiar with my library. He has retweeted me a couple of times. Whether or not he digs it, I guess I'll never really know. I hope he does. He's willing to retweet me, so I'll take that as a win. Anything else? Any others? Anyone want to see the code? You guys want to see the code? Okay, let's look at the code. Now, if you guys have ever read like really generic frameworky code, it's kind of hard to read. This is no exception. So I'll do my best to explain it. It's not very much code, but just the variable names and stuff, not the most difficult to read. Yeah, totally. Is that better? Okay. So the first thing that I do is I bring in my custom, I bring in my built-in validation rules, and I actually use define validator myself to declare which built-in validation rules exist. And so these are just the rules that we saw, the simple validations functions. I'm registering them as built-in rules. Now the validator function, which is the function that we've been seeing, the one that we've been using to perform our validations. I'm going to sort of start from the end and work backwards because I think it makes the most sense. So what this does is I have this object here that gives me some functions that help me perform validations. I have validate child, validate children, and validate. So validate child and validate children basically just do some recursive stuff, right? They go in and call the validator function again, except they add the errors to a deeper part of the error object. So that's how they build up the structure. Then what the actual validate does, then this is the function that takes in the field names and returns an object that you can perform the actual validations on. So this returns the custom validator object. Well, it calls the custom validator function providing the fields. And that returns this object that does some iteration over the custom rules. So for these custom rules then, sorry, I lost my place for a minute. So you look up the configuration for that custom rule, you define the validation, it calls this validate fields function to perform the checks. And then it returns, this is basically just accumulating the validation functions is what it is. So it returns all the built-in validation functions as part of the object, as well as the satisfies function, which takes a list of rules and then it applies validate fields to all the rules against all the fields. So then validate fields, probably, I guess you could call it the workhorse of this whole thing. This is looping over all the fields that are passed in and over all the rules that are passed in. And for each rule field combo, it's calling the rule. And if there's an error message returned from that rule, it appends it to an array. So for each field that's being validated, we maintain an array of error messages, and we just append the error message if we get one for that rule. And that's really all of it. And again, I apologize for, I mean, these things are just naturally cryptic. There's not much that can be done about it. But any questions about the code? You know, that's an excellent question. I had a couple approximations of this before I actually came out with the library. I had a different sort of declarative way to build validation, to do you know, arbitrarily nested validations on the first Redux project that I worked on, and it worked really well, but the code was an absolute nightmare to read, impossible to make sense out of. So when I was working with Reach Local, I tried it in kind of another way, and this sort of started to form. It wasn't quite like this yet, but it was something very much approaching this, and while I was with them, I eventually figured out what this should look like. And built a library out of it. So, I mean, it was really over the course of, I mean, maybe even more than a year that, you know, through just playing with redux-form validations and figuring out how to really make them reusable and figuring out, how do I want to approach this, I eventually came out with something that I thought was really shareable. Yeah. Nothing. Validation is one thing that hasn't changed. Redux-form, you know, they structure your form values object in a certain way that just hasn't changed. I mean, it's just in a totally sensible way. You know, the top level fields are your top level keys of an object, and then if you declare an array or a child object, then it, you know, adds that into your object. And so it's only sensible then that the errors object that they want from your validation function would really mirror that same structure. So I don't expect that to change. If it does, I will shake my fist severely, but I don't know what else I can do. Anyone else? Oh, all right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks so much for coming and sharing.